The screens bled red. Every monitor in the command center of Apex Systems pulsed with the same violent, rhythmic crimson, casting the faces of 37 people in the light of a wound that would not close. The hum of the cooling systems had become a scream pitched just beyond the edge of human tolerance, and the air tasted of ozone and cold coffee and the particular metallic tang of fear that only settles in a room where very smart people have run out of ideas. Catherine Locke stood at the center of it all, her gray power suit fitting her frame like armor forged for a war she had always believed she could win through sheer will alone. Her jaw was set, her hands were steady, but her eyes moved too quickly across the monitors, and that was the tell. She was scanning for answers in a language that had stopped speaking to her. The clock on the far wall read 45 minutes. 45 minutes until the synchronization window for the largest merger in the history of the Pacific Northwest Tech Corridor expired. 45 minutes until the investors in New York, London, and Singapore pulled their commitments. 45 minutes until Apex Systems, a name her father had built from a garage in Beaverton with his own calloused hands, ceased to exist as anything more than a cautionary tale told at Stanford Business School lectures. The core had crashed without warning, without logs, without a single diagnostic breadcrumb. The heartbeat of the company had simply stopped, and every cardiologist in the building was standing around the body, arguing about whether the patient had died of a heart attack or a stroke. In the far corner, near the ventilation access panel he had been repairing when the alarms began, a man in a faded navy blue maintenance jumpsuit stood holding a toolbox. His name tag read Mercer. Nobody looked at him. Nobody ever did. 14 hours earlier, the October sun had barely cleared the tree line east of Portland when Garrett Mercer pressed his palm against the bedroom door of his daughter's room and pushed it open with the gentleness of a man diffusing something precious. Sophie was buried under a comforter printed with cartoon owls, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear to a washing machine 2 years ago and had been surgically repaired with electrical tape. He watched her breathe for 3 seconds. The inhale was shallow. The exhale carried a faint whistle that made his stomach clench the way it always did. A sound that most parents would miss, but that Garrett had learned to measure the way a pilot reads an altimeter. He touched her shoulder. She stirred, blinked, smiled the kind of smile that costs nothing and is worth everything. He had breakfast ready downstairs, scrambled eggs, toast with the crusts cut off because she was 8, and the world owed her that small luxury, a glass of orange juice he had squeezed by hand because the carton stuff made her cough. She sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas, and he set the inhaler next to her plate, the way another father might set down a vitamin. She picked it up without being asked. 2 puffs, held her breath, exhaled. Routine. The routine of a child who had learned too early that her own lungs could betray her. He opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and counted the remaining cartridges. 4. At the current rate, that was 11 days. The refill cost more than his weekly check from Apex, and the insurance that came with his maintenance contract covered the old formulation, not the new one the pulmonologist had recommended after Sophie's last episode in August. He closed the cabinet and did not let his face change because Sophie was watching him the way she always watched him, with those dark eyes that saw more than any child should. She grabbed his pinky finger as he walked her to the truck. The Ford F-150 sat in the driveway like a loyal dog that had aged past beauty into something more important, reliability. It was a 1994 model, forest green paint oxidized to the color of sage, 300,000 miles on the odometer, and an engine that purred like it had just rolled off the assembly line in Dearborn because Garrett rebuilt it himself on weekends using parts he sourced from junkyards and cleaned with the patience of a jeweler. Sophie climbed into the passenger seat and buckled herself in. She looked at him with absolute seriousness. "Pinky promise, Dad. 3:15. Ice cream." His chest filled with something warm and terrifying. The particular weight of a promise made to someone who still believes promises are unbreakable. 3:15. Pinky promise. He dropped her at school, watched her disappear through the double doors, then drove to Apex Systems through the gray Portland morning, past the food carts on Hawthorne, and the cyclists on Division, and the new glass towers downtown that reflected clouds that looked like they had been focus grouped for maximum Pacific Northwest authenticity. The Apex campus occupied a converted warehouse district near the waterfront. 14 buildings, 6,000 employees, a lobby with a waterfall feature that cost more than Garrett's annual salary. He parked the F-150 in the maintenance lot behind Building 7, where the loading docks smelled of cardboard and diesel, and entered through the service corridor that the executives had probably never seen. His morning was fluorescent lights and utility closets, a jammed fire door on the third floor of Building 2, a burnout ballast in the executive washroom that the facilities manager had flagged as urgent because the senior vice president of cloud architecture did not enjoy relieving himself in suboptimal lighting. A ventilation fan in the server wing that had developed a rattle. Garrett moved through the building the way water moves through pipes. Invisible, essential, unacknowledged. He carried his toolbox in his left hand and kept his right hand free, a habit from another life that he no longer thought about consciously, but that his body refused to forget. He was replacing the fan motor on the 4th floor when Bryce Calloway walked past with 2 junior engineers in tow, all 3 staring at tablets, none of them looking where they were going. Calloway's shoulder caught Garrett's arm, knocking the screwdriver from his grip. It clattered on the raised metal floor. Calloway did not stop, did not turn, did not apologize. He simply tossed a sentence over his shoulder like a man flicking ash from a cigarette. "Watch the cables, maintenance." Garrett picked up the screwdriver. His face did not change. He had perfected that particular mask over 3 years and 8 months. The blank, unmoved face of someone who had long ago stopped accepting insults from people whose opinions he did not count as data worth processing. Frank Novak found him in the break room on the ground floor 20 minutes later. Frank was 65 years old, built like a fire hydrant that had been promoted to human form, with a gray crew cut and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same material as the building's foundation. He had been a security guard at Apex for 9 years and had served 20 years in the military before that, which meant he had spent his entire adult life standing watch over things that other people built. He set a cup of coffee in front of Garrett, black, no sugar, from the pot that maintenance kept hidden behind the cleaning supplies because the executive kitchen's artisanal pour-over took 11 minutes, and life was short. Frank settled into the plastic chair across from him with the careful economy of a man whose knees had opinions about the weather. "You know what's funny, Mercer. Those engineers upstairs, they rotate through here faster than the light bulbs you install. 3 CTOs in 2 years, 4 lead architects. But you've been here longer than the waterfall in the lobby." Garrett took a sip of coffee. "The waterfall has better benefits." Frank almost smiled. "I'm serious. You're the most consistent thing in this building." "Light bulbs don't need LinkedIn profiles, Frank." That was as close to friendship as either man was willing to publicly acknowledge. Two working men in a building full of people who measured human worth in stock options, sharing bad coffee and the quiet understanding that the world they maintained would collapse without them and never once say thank you. 3 floors above, in the glass cathedral of her corner office, Catherine Locke was reviewing the final synchronization protocol for the merger with Vincent Hale. Vincent sat across from her in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have spent decades learning how to wear money without appearing to try. He was 55, silver-haired, patrician in bearing, with the calm voice of a man who had been in rooms where decisions were made long before the people currently making them were born. He had been her father's closest advisor, the man who held her hand at the funeral, the man who told her she was ready to lead when she was certain she was not. He asked her about the synchronization schedule, not casually, precisely. What time would the system reach maximum load? How long the window would stay open? Which redundancy protocols were active? Catherine answered without hesitation because Vincent had always asked detailed questions. It was what made him indispensable, and because it never occurred to her that a man who had carried her father's coffin might be measuring the exact moment to bury his daughter's company. Late afternoon. The light through the server wing windows had turned the color of amber. Garrett was finishing the ventilation fan on the 4th floor, tightening the last mounting bolt, when he heard it. Not through the wall, not through the ductwork, but through the floor. A high-frequency whine, thin as a wire, sharp as a needle, vibrating at a pitch that existed in the narrow corridor between mechanical sound and silence. He stopped. He tilted his head. His hand flattened against the raised metal panel beneath him, and he felt the vibration travel through his palm and into the architecture of his memory, into rooms and systems and years he had locked behind doors he never intended to reopen. He knew that sound. He knew what it meant. He knew where it was coming from and what it was doing to the magnetic alignment of the storage platters 2 floors below. And he knew that if someone did not address it, the consequences would be catastrophic. He packed his tools. He stood up. He walked away. Because it was 2:47 in the afternoon, and he had a promise to keep. And some things are worth more than being right. The system crashed at 7 minutes past 6. The screens turned red in a wave that swept through the command center like a hemorrhage. The core stopped responding. No logs, no warnings, no graceful degradation. Just silence where there should have been a heartbeat, and then the alarms, and then the chaos. Engineers flooded the room from every floor. Bryce Calloway was shouting commands that nobody was following because nobody had answers. The software team tore through millions of lines of source code looking for a logic error, a memory leak, a hidden exploit. The code was clean. The hardware team replaced every primary module, every power supply, every cooling unit in the central rack. The diagnostic lights were green. The voltage was steady. The system would not boot. Catherine stood in the center of the room and watched her legacy die in real time. She called the board of directors in New York. Her voice was the only steady thing in the building. A blade that cut through static and panic with surgical precision. If that clock reaches 0, the investors pull out, and we are bankrupt by morning. She hung up and faced her team. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of defeat, heavy as concrete, settling into the shoulders of every person in the room. She looked at them. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Oxford, graduates who charged $1,000 an hour and could not, in this moment, produce a single idea worth a penny. Her voice dropped to something worse than a shout, a whisper that carried to every corner. I pay you millions to be the best, and now you are telling me the impossible has happened, that you have nothing. Nobody answered. Nobody could meet her eyes. The countdown read 20 minutes. In the back of the room, near the ventilation panel, Garrett Mercer stood with his toolbox. He had not left the building. He had been 2 floors down, finishing a work order on a cooling unit when the alarms triggered. He had come up to see if anyone needed the service corridors cleared for emergency access. Nobody had asked. Nobody had noticed. He was watching the engineers with the detached precision of a man reading an instrument panel in a language only he still spoke. And he could hear it, beneath the shouting, beneath the frantic keystrokes, beneath the hum of backup generators. The same high-frequency whine he had heard that afternoon, louder now, more insistent, a cry from a machine that was being killed by its own guardians. Catherine's voice came through the speakers, carried by the emergency intercom to every floor of the building. 3,000 families depend on tonight. Garrett closed his eyes. He thought of Frank at the security desk downstairs. He thought of Maria in custodial who sent half her paycheck to her mother. He thought of the interns in the mailroom who still believed hard work meant something. He thought of Sophie, who was waiting at an after-school program because he had called her teacher at 3:12 and asked for an extension, his voice tight with the guilt of a man breaking the one covenant he had sworn never to break. He thought of the inhaler cartridges in the cabinet. 4 left, 11 days. No insurance if Apex went under. He looked at his watch. 3:05 was a memory now. The ice cream was a debt he would carry home tonight and repay with interest. An extra story, a longer hug. The particular currency of fathers who know that time is the only thing you cannot earn back. He did not step forward. Not yet. He stood in the corner and listened to the machine dying and felt the old architecture stirring in his blood like a language he had sworn he would never speak again. And he understood with the clarity of a man standing at the edge of a life he had carefully built that the next 60 seconds would decide whether that life survived or burned. The clock read 19 minutes. The room was silent. The screens pulsed red, and Garrett Mercer, the man nobody saw, took one step toward the light. He crossed the room the way a current moves through still water. Without urgency, without hesitation, with the quiet inevitability of something that has already decided where it is going. The engineers did not notice him at first. They were too busy drowning in their own expertise, cycling through diagnostic protocols that had been designed for problems that existed inside screens, not inside the bones of the machine itself. Garrett moved between workstations with the spatial awareness of a man who had spent 3 years memorizing every cable run, every floor panel seam, every blind spot in a building that treated him as furniture. His toolbox hung from his left hand. His eyes were fixed on the central server rack, where the emergency lights painted the housing in alternating bands of red and shadow, and where the sound, that thin, insistent whine, was loudest. Bryce Calloway saw him first. The engineer stepped into his path with the reflexive authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone holding a mop. His face was slick with sweat and wounded pride. A man failing publicly at the only thing he was hired to do. He planted himself between Garrett and the rack like a bouncer at a club that was already on fire. This isn't a clogged toilet, maintenance. Get out before you trip over the fiber optics. You know how much one of these cables costs? A pause calibrated for maximum condescension. more than your house, probably more than your truck. Garrett did not look at Bryce. He did not have time for men who confused volume with competence. He looked past him, directly at Catherine Locke, who was standing 6 feet away with a phone in one hand and the weight of 3,000 livelihoods pressing down on her shoulders with a force that no degree from Wharton had prepared her to bear. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the raw, exposed nerve of a leader who had exhausted every option that money and credentials could buy, and was now standing in the gap between strategy and annihilation, with nothing left to deploy. The diagnostic software is clean because the error isn't digital. His voice was steady and low, carrying a resonance that made Bryce hesitate, and 2 junior engineers stopped typing. It was not the voice of a man asking for permission. It was the voice of a man stating a physical law. You're looking for a ghost in the code, but the problem is in the floor beneath your feet. The secondary cooling pump is vibrating at a resonant frequency that's interfering with the magnetic alignment of the storage platters. Your software thinks the hardware is dead because it can't read the data. Your hardware thinks the software is corrupted because the feedback signal is distorted. They're locked in a physical echo loop. You cannot reboot a car while the engine is shaking itself apart. Catherine's eyes narrowed. The analytical machinery behind them, the part of her that had turned a grieving daughter's inheritance into a global technology company, engaged with the precision of a lock finding its key. She heard something in his voice that she had not heard from anyone else in the room all night. Not hope, not theory, certainty. Bryce let out a sharp laugh that cracked at the edges. Resonant vibration. That rack is mounted on military-grade shock absorbers rated for seismic zones. It's physically impossible. He's a janitor, Miss Locke. He's reciting science fiction because he wants his 15 minutes. Catherine looked at the clock. 19 minutes. She looked at her team. 43 combined degrees, 200 years of collective experience, and not one of them could produce a single sentence that did not end in a question mark or an excuse. She looked at Garrett. She saw a man who was not sweating, a man whose hands were not shaking, a man who stood the way load-bearing walls stand, quietly, without advertisement, holding up everything above them. Step aside. The words were aimed at Bryce, but they detonated across the entire room. Bryce opened his mouth to protest, something about safety protocols and liability, and Catherine turned on him with a look that could have stripped paint from steel. I said, step aside. She turned back to Garrett, her eyes searching his the way a drowning person searches the face of someone standing on solid ground. You have 60 seconds. If you're wrong, you will never work in this city again, and I will personally ensure you are held liable for interference. If you're right, just fix it. Garrett walked to the central rack. He did not reach for a diagnostic tool. He did not ask for a password. He did not glance at the monitors that had become the collective obsession of every genius in the room. He reached into the side pocket of his jumpsuit and pulled out a wrench with a worn wooden handle, the grain darkened by 20 years of palm oil and machine grease, the metal head scarred with the kind of honest wear that comes from 10,000 precise adjustments. He knelt on the raised floor, ignoring the cold metal against his knees, ignoring the CEO standing over his shoulder, ignoring the engineers whose contempt was curdling into something more complicated. He pressed his ear against the server housing. He placed his right hand flat against the frame. He closed his eyes. The room watched a maintenance man listen to a machine, the way a doctor listens to a heart. His fingers found the access panel at the base of the rack. A small rectangular plate secured by 4 Phillips head screws that none of the engineers had touched because it was below the diagnostic tier, below the modular components, below the architecture they had been trained to think about. It covered the cooling assembly's mounting bracket, a piece of infrastructure so fundamental it was invisible. Garrett removed the panel. Behind a layer of high-specification thermal insulation, his fingers located a specific tension bolt on the secondary cooling pump housing. A bolt that controlled the alignment of the pump's rotational axis. A bolt that he had warned his superiors about 12 years ago, sitting in a conference room in a building that no longer existed, explaining to men who no longer remembered his name that this particular junction point would develop harmonic instability under sustained maximum load. They had called it theoretical. They had called it not cost-effective. They had moved on to the next slide. He gave the bolt a quarter turn. The adjustment was microscopic. To anyone watching, he did nothing. To the machine, he performed surgery on its spine. The whine dropped in pitch. The vibration against his palm dissolved into a smooth, steady hum. The sound of alignment, the sound of a symphony finding its tuning note after an hour of discord. Garrett kept his hand on the housing for 2 more seconds, reading the new frequency through his skin, confirming what his mind already knew. Now, reboot the primary bridge. Only the bridge, not the full system. A junior engineer, a young woman who had been watching from behind her senior colleagues with the alertness of someone who had not yet learned to stop paying attention, hit the sequence on the nearest terminal. The room held its breath. 5 seconds passed in a silence so complete that Garrett could hear the blood moving through his own ears. Bryce's hand was already reaching for his phone, his thumb hovering over the security desk extension, the muscles in his face arranged into the preliminary architecture of vindication. A chime, soft, melodic, almost gentle, the sound of a system waking from a nightmare and finding itself whole. The wall monitors flickered. The red banners dissolved like fog in morning sun. A single line of white text appeared on a deep blue field. System stable, all sectors online. The indicators turned green in sequence. Data throughput climbing in a smooth exponential curve. 10%, 30, 50, 80, 100. The merger synchronization frozen for 5 hours. Completed in a burst of processing speed that made the monitoring graph spike like a heartbeat restored. The clock stopped at 7 minutes and 12 seconds remaining. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved. The silence that followed was not relief. It was awe. The stunned, breathless recognition that something impossible had just happened in front of 40 witnesses, performed by a man who was currently standing up, closing a 4-inch access panel and wiping a smudge of grease from his wrench with a cotton rag he kept in his back pocket. He looked like a man who had just finished tightening a fence post, not a man who had resurrected a global financial engine from clinical death with a quarter turn of a 20-year-old tool. Catherine Locke stood frozen. Her monitors glowed green. Her merger was saved. Her father's legacy would survive another day, and she was staring at the calloused hands of a maintenance worker and feeling the tectonic plates of her understanding shift beneath her feet. In 60 seconds, this man had accomplished what $100 million of engineering talent could not produce in 5 hours. She looked at the wrench in his hand, at the grease under his nails, at the quiet composure of a man who had just performed a miracle and appeared to be thinking about something else entirely, and she felt something crack in the glass architecture of her worldview, a fracture that would not stop spreading. Garrett looked at the clock on the wall. 3:35. His face changed for the first time all night. a flash of something that was not fear, but its close relative, the panic of a man who has kept a promise every day for 8 years and is watching the streak begin to break. "I have to go." He snapped the toolbox shut. Catherine's voice came back to her breathless, stripped of its corporate cadence. "You just saved a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You pulled us back from the edge of total collapse. You are not going anywhere. We need to talk. We need to understand what just... I have to pick up my daughter." His voice carried no defiance, no drama, no negotiation. It carried the simple, immovable weight of a man stating the hierarchy of his universe. "I promised her ice cream. I'm already 20 minutes late, and I don't break my promises to her. Not for this, not for anything." He walked toward the exit. The engineers parted, not because anyone told them to, not because they were afraid, because they were standing in the presence of a gravity they had never encountered in any textbook or boardroom or server architecture diagram. The gravity of a man who had just held their entire world in his hands and set it down gently so he could go hold his daughter's hand instead. Catherine did not follow him. She watched him disappear through the service corridor, and then she turned to the room with eyes that had changed temperature by several degrees. The ice was still there, but beneath it, something was moving. Something that looked like the early, dangerous stirrings of a question she was not yet ready to ask. She pulled her lead auditor aside within the hour. The system was stable, the junior engineers were running integrity checks, and the senior staff were performing the delicate corporate ritual of pretending they had contributed to the solution. Catherine had no patience for theater. She wanted forensics. "I want to know why that bolt was loose. I want to know what happened to the cooling pump firmware. And I want to know exactly who Garrett Mercer is. Everything. From the day he was born." The auditor returned 31 minutes later. His hands were shaking so severely that the tablet he carried rattled against his palm like a snare drum. He closed the door to Catherine's glass office and stood in front of her desk the way defendants stand before judges. The vibration wasn't wear and tear. It wasn't an accident. His voice was barely above a whisper. The cooling pump was deliberately overclocked through a hidden firmware patch embedded inside a routine security update. It was engineered to trigger that specific physical resonance only when the system was running at maximum load, like during a merger synchronization. It was designed to look like a random hardware failure, a timed detonation. Catherine felt the temperature in her blood drop by several degrees. "Who authorized the update?" The auditor swallowed. He glanced at the door. The authorization code was traced to a private terminal. It belongs to Vincent Hale. The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Vincent Hale. The man who had held her hand at her father's funeral. The man who had taught her to read a balance sheet before she could drive. The man who had sat across from her desk 14 hours ago and asked, with the precision of an engineer timing a demolition, exactly when the system would be at maximum load. Catherine's mind reassembled every conversation, every late-night call, every reassuring hand on her shoulder, and watched them rearrange into the blueprint of a betrayal so intimate it felt like surgery performed without anesthesia. He wanted the merger to fail. She said it flatly, not as a question but as a diagnosis. The stock crashes, his investor group buys up the devalued shares. He walks in as the savior who rebuilds what he destroyed. The auditor nodded, pale. "There's more." He turned the tablet toward her. "We looked into Garrett Mercer's records. We had to bypass 3 layers of encrypted government archives to find this. 8 years ago, he went dark, erased his digital footprint completely. But before that, the auditor's voice trailed off, as though the information he was about to deliver had a physical weight he was struggling to lift. He was the chief architect for the Aegis Systems Initiative, classified federal contract. He designed the foundational protocol architecture that every major data processing system in North America is built on, including ours, including the core he just repaired. The internal project team called him the architect. Catherine took the tablet. The screen showed a cascade of documents, patent filings, peer-reviewed publications, security clearance records, and a photograph that made her stop breathing. A younger Garrett Mercer, perhaps 30, clean-shaven, wearing a dark suit, shaking hands with the President of the United States at a ceremony honoring contributions to national technological infrastructure. His eyes in the photograph were the same eyes she had looked into 20 minutes ago in the command center, calm, precise, carrying the quiet weight of a man who understands systems that other people can only operate. But in the photograph, those eyes were brighter. There was no shadow behind them. She scrolled to his personnel file. Employment history. 4 years at the pinnacle of a field that worshipped him, followed by a single date. The date of termination. She cross-referenced it against public records and found a death certificate filed the same day. Lauren Mercer, age 31. Motor vehicle accident. 2:14 a.m. Interstate 84 eastbound. The deceased was traveling to retrieve her spouse from a laboratory facility. A surviving infant, 3 weeks old, was in the care of a neighbor at the time of the accident. Catherine set the tablet down. She looked through the glass wall of her office at the command center where the monitors glowed a steady, healthy green. She looked at the maintenance roster on her desktop screen and found his name, Mercer, Garrett J., listed between a plumber and an electrician, billing rate $31 per hour, security clearance level, custodial. She had employed the most consequential mind in the American technology sector to replace light bulbs and unclogged drains for 3 years and 7 months. She had paid him less per hour than her executive assistant spent on lunch. And she had paid Vincent Hale, the man who had just tried to murder her father's company, $2.4 million annually for the privilege of being betrayed by someone she loved. The irony was not intellectual. It was physical. She felt it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, displacing everything. Air, certainty, the careful taxonomy of value she had built her entire professional identity upon. She had spent a decade searching for visionaries in boardrooms and conference keynotes and venture capital dinners, evaluating brilliance by the weight of its resume and the cut of its suit. And the man who built the world she stood on had been standing in her shadow the entire time, holding a mop, asking for nothing, invisible by choice. She picked up her phone and called the head of corporate security. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness now had a different quality. Not the brittle composure of a woman managing a crisis, but the cold, focused clarity of a woman who had just discovered that the war she thought she was winning had been a different war entirely, fought on a battlefield she never knew existed. Find Vincent Hale. He's likely headed for the private airfield on Sauvie Island. Intercept him. I don't care what resources it requires. And call the FBI. Tell them we have evidence of corporate sabotage and attempted destruction of critical national infrastructure. She set the phone down and looked again at the photograph on the tablet. The young man with the bright eyes, shaking the hand of the most powerful person in the world. 12 years before, he knelt on a dirty floor in a faded jumpsuit and saved everything she had ever built with a quarter turn of a wrench that cost less than her morning coffee. She reached for her car keys. Vincent Hale was arrested at 11:47 p.m. on a private airstrip on Sauvie Island, 9 miles northwest of downtown Portland, standing beside a Cessna Citation that had been fueled and filed for a flight plan to Grand Cayman with a refueling stop in Houston. He was carrying 2 aluminum-cased hard drives containing encrypted financial records, 3 prepaid mobile phones still in their packaging, and a leather portfolio holding share transfer documents that would have given a consortium of anonymous investors, operating through 4 shell companies registered in Delaware, Wyoming, and the British Virgin Islands, a controlling interest in Apex Systems at roughly 14 cents on the dollar. The FBI agents who pulled him off the tarmac did so in front of 11 journalists and 2 camera crews, all of whom Vincent had personally invited earlier that evening to document what he had expected to be Catherine Locke's public humiliation. The cameras captured something different. They captured a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit being guided into the back of a federal vehicle with his wrists bound in steel, his face illuminated by the strobe of flashbulbs he had ordered for someone else's destruction. Catherine watched the arrest footage from her office at 1:17 a.m., standing behind her desk with her arms crossed and her jaw set so tight the muscles in her neck were visible. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt the cold, hollow vertigo of a woman who has just discovered that the floor she has been standing on for 15 years was built over a sinkhole. Vincent had been closer to her than any board member, any advisor, any friend. He had been the living extension of her father's judgment. The one person in the world she trusted not because of what he could do, but because of who she believed he was. She had been wrong about him in the way that only intimacy allows, the kind of wrongness that doesn't just damage your assessment of one person, but contaminates your ability to assess anyone at all. She closed the footage and opened Garrett Mercer's file. She had read it 4 times already. Each reading rearranged something inside her, like furniture being moved in a dark room. She kept returning to the photograph, the young man with the bright eyes and the presidential handshake, and then looking through her office glass at the command center, where 12 hours ago, that same man had knelt on a dirty floor in a jumpsuit and performed the kind of miracle that her $100 million team could not produce with every advantage civilization had to offer. She picked up her car keys for the 2nd time that night. Garrett was sitting on a bench in Wallace Park, 3 blocks from Sophie's school, at 7:15 the following morning. The October air was cool enough to see breath, and the grass was still dark with overnight moisture. Sophie was beside him on the bench, working through a chocolate ice cream cone with the methodical intensity of a structural engineer demolishing a project on deadline. Her face was streaked with chocolate. Her backpack sat at her feet, covered in iron-on patches of owls and planets that Garrett had applied himself using a kitchen iron and a level of concentration that the task did not technically require, but that he gave it anyway, because everything he did for Sophie received the full weight of his attention. It was the only currency he trusted himself to spend. He had picked her up 43 minutes late the previous evening. She had not cried. She had not complained. She had looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes and said nothing, which was worse than any accusation, because silence from a child who trusts you is not forgiveness. It is faith, and faith is heavier than blame. He had driven straight to the ice cream shop on Hawthorne, ordered her a double chocolate in a waffle cone, and sat with her on this bench while the sun went down and the streetlights came on and the world shrank to the size of two people and one rapidly diminishing dessert. He owed her a second cone this morning. Debts to Sophie accrued interest at a rate no financial instrument could match. The black sedan appeared at the curb at 7:22. Catherine Locke stepped out wearing clothes Garrett had never seen on her. Dark jeans, a gray wool coat, flat shoes. She had removed the armor. Without the power suit and the heels and the glass-walled office framing her like a portrait of authority, she looked like what she was underneath all of it, a 40-year-old woman who had not slept, who had been betrayed by the person she trusted most, and who was walking across wet grass toward a man she did not understand but could no longer afford to ignore. She sat down on the bench. The plastic seat was cold and slightly warped, and it creaked under her weight with the democratic indifference of public furniture that does not care whether its occupant runs a corporation or a cash register. Sophie looked up from her cone, assessed the newcomer with the unsentimental clarity of an 8-year-old, and arrived at a conclusion. "Are you a queen, ma'am?" Garrett's mouth twitched, the closest he came to a public smile. In her world, yes. Catherine looked at the child and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a corporate vocabulary for. She turned to Garrett. She made the offer she had rehearsed in the car. Chief Technology Officer. Compensation package that would have made his old Aegis salary look like pocket change. Full authority to restructure the engineering division. A corner office with a view of Mount Hood. She delivered it the way she delivered everything, precisely, confidently, with the implicit assumption that the value proposition was self-evident. Garrett watched Sophie negotiate a drip of chocolate that was threatening the structural integrity of her waffle cone. He did not look at Catherine when he answered, "Buildings are heavy, Catherine, and cold. I spent half my life constructing things that lived inside boxes. I'd rather build something that can smile back at me." He tilted his head toward Sophie. "That's my legacy. The core is just a machine." Catherine absorbed the refusal without flinching, which cost her more effort than anything she had done in the boardroom. She recalibrated. She offered a consulting contract, part-time, flexible hours, his schedule, his terms. Full benefits package including comprehensive medical coverage for dependents. She watched his eyes when she said the word medical, and she saw the almost invisible contraction around his jaw. The micro-expression of a man for whom that word carried weight that had nothing to do with corporate perks and everything to do with an 8-year-old's lungs. "I'll think about it." He said it to the ice cream cone, not to her. But they both understood that the negotiation had already concluded, and the terms had been set not by salary figures, but by the sound of a child's shallow breathing on a cold October morning. Catherine stood. She looked at Garrett and Sophie on the bench, the maintenance man and his daughter, sharing ice cream in a public park at 7:30 in the morning. And she felt the distance between this image and the world she inhabited every day stretch into something vast and uncomfortable, a gap that no amount of money or power could bridge, but that she was beginning to suspect she needed to cross. She drove back to Apex. Garrett drove Sophie to school. At the drop-off, Sophie grabbed his pinky with chocolate sticky fingers and held on for 3 seconds longer than usual. She did not say anything. She did not need to. That night, alone in the apartment after Sophie fell asleep, Garrett sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the refrigerator hummed a note that was slightly flat. Sophie's drawings covered the refrigerator door. Owls, stars, a stick figure man with oversized hands holding a wrench, a woman with wings labeled Mom in purple crayon. The medical supplies occupied a shelf above the kitchen counter. Inhalers, a nebulizer, spacer masks in 2 sizes, a laminated action plan from the pulmonologist taped to the cabinet door with instructions for what to do when Sophie's peak flow dropped below the yellow zone. The shelf looked like a small pharmacy and cost like one too. He closed his eyes and the dream came the way it always did, without permission and without mercy. Lauren in the kitchen of their first apartment in San Jose, laughing at something he had said, her hand on her belly where Sophie was 8 months along and already kicking with the impatience of someone who had places to be. The sunlight through the window catching the auburn in her hair. The smell of coffee and cinnamon toast and the particular warmth of a life that has not yet learned it is temporary. Then the cut, brutal, cinematic, the kind of edit that the sleeping mind performs with the cruelty of a surgeon who does not believe in anesthesia. The phone on the nightstand. The blue light of the screen at 2:14 a.m. A voice he did not recognize telling him things in a sequence that his brain received but could not assemble into meaning. Interstate 84. Eastbound. Vehicle left the roadway. His wife's name spoken by a stranger. The hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fluorescent light. Lauren's hand in his, already cooling, already becoming a memory, while 3 miles away, a neighbor held his newborn daughter and wondered when the father would come home. Garrett opened his eyes. The clock read 2:17 a.m. He sat in the dark and breathed and did not move for 11 minutes, because moving would mean re-entering a world in which Lauren was dead, and the reason she was dead was that she had gotten in a car at 2 a.m. to drive to a laboratory where her husband was so absorbed in the architecture of a machine that he had forgotten the architecture of his own life. That was the equation he carried. That was the weight, not grief. Guilt. Grief fades. Guilt calcifies. It becomes part of the bone. He accepted the consulting contract the following Monday. Not for the money, not for the title, for the insurance card that arrived in a manila envelope 3 days later, listing Sophie Mercer as a covered dependent with access to the Tier 3 pharmaceutical formulary that included the new corticosteroid her pulmonologist had been recommending since August. He held the card in his hands and felt the specific, bitter relief of a man who has sold something he cannot name in exchange for something his daughter needs to breathe. His terms were carved in stone, 4 hours per day, 8 a.m. to noon, every day. At 12:01, he would be walking to his truck. At 3:15, he would be standing at the school gate. No exceptions, no flexibility, no emergencies that superseded the geometry of his daughter's day. Catherine agreed without negotiation, which told Garrett more about her intelligence than any quarterly earnings report ever could. The first week ignited 3 fires simultaneously, each burning on a different floor of his carefully partitioned life. Bryce Calloway declared war on the first morning. Not openly. Bryce was too political for frontal assault. The campaign was architectural, designed to undermine through infrastructure rather than confrontation. Garrett arrived at his temporary workstation to find his network credentials restricted to guest-level access. A help desk ticket filed under his name requested only email and basic intranet privileges, with a note from Bryce's assistant citing standard onboarding protocol for external consultants. Garrett could see the system topology but could not touch it. He could read the patient's chart but could not pick up a scalpel. He mentioned it to no one. Instead, he spent his first 3 mornings mapping the system's current state through observation alone, reading data flow patterns on monitoring screens, timing server response cycles with his watch, listening to the pitch of cooling fans the way a mechanic listens to an engine through a stethoscope. By Wednesday, he had identified 2 latent vulnerabilities that Bryce's team had not detected: a memory allocation drift in the secondary processing cluster and a thermal cycling pattern in Rack 7 that would cause a cascade failure within 6 to 8 weeks. He documented both in a report that he left on Catherine's desk without commentary or signature. When Bryce's team discovered the issues 3 days later during a routine audit, the fixes were already outlined in detail. Nobody mentioned where the report came from. Garrett did not need credit. He needed the machine to be healthy. Everything else was noise. Bryce escalated. Small acts of sabotage disguised as administrative oversights. Garrett's badge deactivated for 22 minutes on a Thursday morning. His workstation relocated to a windowless storage room that smelled of printer toner. His name omitted from the distribution list for a critical firmware review meeting. Each time, Garrett adapted without complaint, rerouting around the obstruction the way water finds the lowest point. He left digital breadcrumbs in his work that only someone who understood the original system architecture would recognize: elegant, minimal annotations embedded in the diagnostic logs, like a signature written in a language that Bryce could not read, but that the machine itself remembered. He was not fighting Bryce. He was playing a longer game on a larger board, and the pieces he was moving were made of patience and precision, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who built the castle that the knights were now defending without knowing who drew the blueprints. Catherine began finding reasons to visit his workstation. The first time, it was a legitimate technical question about the Core's failover protocols. The second time, it was a question about thermal management that she could have answered herself. By the third visit, neither of them pretended the questions were about technology. She stood in the doorway of his storage room office, arms crossed, watching him work with the focused stillness of a woman studying something she could not yet categorize. She told him about her father on a Thursday afternoon, leaning against the door frame while rain streaked the narrow window behind her. Douglas Locke founded Apex in 1991 in a rented garage in Beaverton with a soldering iron and a business plan written on the back of a utility bill. He had been an engineer before he became a CEO. Hands-on, obsessive, the kind of man who would disassemble a server rack at midnight because he heard a fan bearing that was 0.3 decibels louder than specification. He built the company the way some men build cathedrals, with the faith that the structure would outlast the builder. He died 5 years ago. Heart attack, at his desk, 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. His assistant found him the next morning with his hand still on the mouse, the screen showing a system diagnostic report that would never be reviewed. Catherine's voice did not break when she told the story. It did something worse. It flattened, the way a landscape flattens after a flood, everything leveled to the same emotional altitude, and Garrett recognized the terrain because he had lived in it for 8 years. She looked at the wall above his monitor, not at him, when she said, "I built this company to make him proud. Every decision, every acquisition, every 16-hour day. But the truth is, I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything would have been enough." He was the kind of man who saw potential the way other people see color, everywhere, in everything, impossible to ignore. And I have spent my entire adult life trying to fill a space that was shaped like him, and I am starting to suspect that the space was never meant to be filled. It was meant to be lived next to. Garrett was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years thinking about the difference between building and losing. He built with his hands. You build with will. Different method, same destination. Catherine looked at him then, not at the maintenance man, not at the architect, but at the person underneath both costumes. And something in her expression changed the way a locked door changes when someone finds the right key. Not open yet, just ready. The media found him on a Wednesday. The leak traced back to an anonymous tip sent from a personal email account that Bryce Calloway would later claim had been compromised, a defense that convinced no one but that could not be technically disproven. The Portland Oregonian ran the story first. The architect returns. Tech legend found working as janitor at Apex Systems. Within 6 hours, the story had been picked up by Wired, TechCrunch, The Wall Street Journal, and 14 broadcast affiliates. By Thursday morning, a satellite truck was parked outside Sophie's school, and a reporter with a microphone was standing at the entrance asking 8-year-olds if they knew Sophie Mercer. Garrett learned about the reporters from Sophie's teacher, who called him at 11:40 a.m. He was in his truck and moving before the call ended, arriving at the school in 9 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than the route should have allowed and which involved the Ford F-150 demonstrating cornering capabilities that its engineers in Dearborn had never intended or tested. He found the reporter at the entrance, a young man in a blue blazer with a camera crew and the bright, hollow certainty that every door would open for him. Garrett walked up to him, stood close enough that the reporter had to tilt his head back, and spoke with a voice that carried no volume but absolute, non-negotiable force. My daughter is not your story. She is not a character in whatever narrative you are building about me. She is 8 years old, and she has asthma, and she does not need strangers with cameras waiting for her at the place where she is supposed to feel safe. You will leave this property. You will not return. And you will not use her name, her image, or her likeness in any publication or broadcast. That is not a request. The reporter opened his mouth. Garrett held his gaze without blinking, without moving, without offering the reporter the smallest crack of uncertainty to wedge a follow-up question into. The reporter closed his mouth. The crew packed up. Garrett took Sophie's hand and walked her to the truck, and she looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and pride. The face of a child who has just watched her quiet, invisible father become the most formidable person she has ever seen. The stress test was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a full-load simulation designed to prove system stability to Meridian Capital, the lead investment partner in the merger. Catherine had staked her credibility on the demonstration. Bryce had spent 48 hours preparing his team. The Meridian delegation arrived at 9 a.m., 4 executives in dark suits, a technical auditor with a laptop, and a gray-haired man named Howard Prewitt who had been evaluating enterprise systems since before most of Bryce's engineers were born. The test began at 9:15. At 9:22, the system locked. Not a crash, a freeze. Every process suspended. Every screen static. The core was alive but paralyzed, caught in a deadlock condition that the monitoring software had not predicted because the deadlock existed in a layer of the architecture that the monitoring software did not know about. Bryce's face lost color so fast it looked like a special effect. His team scattered to their terminals, typing commands that returned nothing, running diagnostics that could not reach the frozen layer, shouting increasingly technical contradictions at each other, while the Meridian delegation watched with the neutral, evaluative patience of people who have seen companies die before and recognize the symptoms. Garrett was at his workstation in the storage room when the alert reached his screen. He walked to the command center without hurrying. He entered through the side door. He moved to a secondary terminal that Bryce's team had not touched because it was connected to the legacy monitoring system, the original architecture, his architecture, and typed 3 commands in sequence. His fingers moved with the fluency of a man writing in his mother tongue after years of speaking a foreign language. The deadlock resolved in 11 seconds. The system resumed. The screens returned to life. The test continued without further incident. Howard Prewitt, the gray-haired Meridian auditor, was the only person in the room who had stopped watching the screens and started watching Garrett. He walked over after the test concluded, his eyes carrying the sharp, layered recognition of a man who reads technical papers the way other people read novels. "You're Mercer. Garrett Mercer." Not a question, a confirmation. "I cited your distributed consensus paper in my doctoral thesis 12 years ago. Everyone in my cohort did. You rewrote how we think about fault tolerance." He extended his hand. Garrett shook it, briefly, firmly, without comment. Catherine was standing 12 feet away. She had watched the entire sequence, the freeze, the panic, Garrett's unhurried entrance, his 3 commands, the resurrection. She had watched Prewitt cross the room to shake his hand with the deference of a student meeting the author of the textbook. And she had watched Garrett receive it all with the same expression he wore when replacing a light bulb. Competent, present, already thinking about the next task. Their eyes met across the room. He did not look away this time. Neither did she. The moment lasted 2 seconds and contained more information than any conversation they had shared. That evening, in a federal detention facility 40 miles south of Portland, Vincent Hale sat across from his attorney in a concrete-walled consultation room and dictated a message. The message was not addressed to the court. It was not addressed to Catherine Locke. It was addressed to Richard Keene, a 52-year-old member of the Apex Systems Board of Directors who had served on the audit committee for 6 years, and who had, for the last 19 months, been receiving quarterly payments from the same Delaware shell company that funded Vincent's consortium. The message was brief. It contained a date, a procedural clause from the Apex corporate charter regarding emergency sessions, and a single instruction. Richard Keene received the message at 9:40 p.m. through a secure channel managed by Vincent's attorney. He read it twice. He picked up his phone and called 3 other board members. By 10:15, a formal request had been filed with the Apex corporate secretary for an extraordinary session of the board of directors, citing concerns about executive decision-making, fiduciary responsibility, and the unauthorized appointment of an unvetted external consultant with access to critical system infrastructure. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. Catherine would not learn about it until Thursday afternoon, when the corporate secretary placed the notice on her desk with an apology and a look that suggested he had already started updating his resume. By then, the trap would be fully built, the bait already set, and the only person who might have seen it coming would be sitting in a storage room that smelled of printer toner, reading system logs in a language that nobody else in the building could speak, unaware that the architecture he had spent his life building, both digital and personal, was about to be tested in ways that no diagnostic tool could predict and no quarter turn of a wrench could fix. The board convened at 9 a.m. on Friday in the 32nd floor conference room of Building 1, a glass-walled chamber designed to project transparency while providing none. Richard Keene had arrived early, 7:45, and arranged the room himself, adjusting the placement of water glasses and name cards with the meticulous attention of a man who understands that power lives in details. He positioned himself at the center of the long mahogany table, directly across from the chair reserved for the CEO. a seating arrangement that transformed a corporate governance meeting into a tribunal. The other board members filed in between 8:30 and 8:50. 3 had been contacted by Keene directly, 2 had been briefed by proxies, and 1, Margaret Ashford, the longest-serving independent director, arrived with an expression that suggested she had already decided this was a waste of her morning and would require substantial evidence to change her mind. Catherine entered at 8:58. She had chosen her attire with the strategic precision of a general dressing for a battle she did not yet know the shape of. Charcoal suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back, every line of her appearance communicating control and competence. She had received the meeting notice less than 18 hours ago. Her legal team had spent the night preparing a defense for charges they could not fully identify, because the formal agenda cited only concerns regarding executive decision-making and fiduciary oversight, a phrase so deliberately vague it could mean anything from a policy disagreement to a coup. Keene opened the session with the practiced solemnity of a man eulogizing someone who was still breathing. He spoke for 14 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not make accusations. He constructed a narrative from facts that were technically accurate and contextually devastating. Catherine Locke had, in the aftermath of the system crisis, hired an external consultant with no verifiable professional credentials in the last decade, granted this consultant access to critical system infrastructure without a formal security clearance review, and established a compensation package that included full executive tier benefits, all without board approval. The consultant in question had no corporate technology experience since his departure from a classified government project 8 years ago. His most recent verifiable employment was as a maintenance contractor earning $31 per hour. The risk profile of this decision, Keene argued with the measured cadence of a man who has rehearsed his lines until they sound spontaneous, was inconsistent with the fiduciary responsibilities of a CEO managing a $2.3 billion merger. He did not mention Garrett's name. He did not need to. The word maintenance carried its own gravitational field in a room full of people who measured human value in credential density and compensation brackets. Catherine defended her decision with the precision and force that had made her one of the most respected executives on the West Coast. She presented Garrett's qualifications, the Aegis systems record, the patents, the presidential recognition. She presented the forensic evidence of Vincent Hale's sabotage. She presented the technical analysis showing that Garrett had identified and resolved a failure mode that her entire engineering department had missed. She was articulate, factual, and compelling. And it did not matter, because Keene had not built his case on facts. He had built it on fear. The board members who had been contacted in advance were not voting on whether Catherine was right. They were voting on whether they wanted their names associated with a CEO who had entrusted the backbone of a publicly traded company to a man who, 6 weeks ago, had been emptying their trash cans. The vote was 5-3. Catherine Locke was suspended from executive authority pending a full operational review. Richard Keene was appointed interim chief executive, effective immediately. Margaret Ashford cast one of the 3 dissenting votes and left the room without speaking to anyone, her silence louder than anything Keene had said. Catherine stood in the conference room after the others had filed out, alone with the water glasses and the empty chairs, and the view of Mount Hood through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The mountain was clear that morning, its glaciers catching the early sun, and she thought about her father standing in this same room 20 years ago, when the walls were cheaper and the furniture was second-hand, telling her that the only thing a building needs to stand is a foundation that tells the truth. She had believed him. she had built accordingly. And the foundation had just been pulled out from under her by a man who smiled while he poured the concrete. Keene's first official act was a memorandum distributed at 10:15 a.m., terminating the consulting agreement with Garrett Mercer, revoking all building access credentials, and instructing the Human Resources Department to process the separation immediately, including the discontinuation of all associated benefits effective at the close of business. The memorandum was copied to legal, compliance, the IT security team, and, in a flourish of bureaucratic cruelty that Keene delivered with the efficiency of a man who understands that the most effective weapons are administrative. The benefits coordinator responsible for dependent medical coverage. Garrett received the call at 11:07. A woman from HR whose voice was stiff with discomfort. She had been ordered to deliver this and clearly wished she hadn't. His access had been revoked. His contract was terminated. His benefits, including the dependent medical rider, would lapse at 5 p.m. She paused after this last item, and in the pause Garrett heard the shape of an apology that corporate protocol would not allow her to speak. He thanked her. He set the phone on the kitchen counter. He looked at the cabinet above the refrigerator where the inhaler cartridges were stored. 3 left now. Maybe 9 days. Sophie came home from school at 3:20. He had picked her up at 3:15, precisely on time, because a man who has lost his job and his insurance and his access to the building where he had spent 3 years becoming invisible does not break a pinky promise to his daughter over something as small as the collapse of his professional life. She dropped her backpack by the door and showed him a drawing she had made in art class. A purple owl wearing a hard hat and holding a wrench. She had written "Dad" underneath in capital letters. He put it on the refrigerator next to the others and felt something in his chest that was not pain but its neighbor. The particular ache of being loved by someone who does not yet understand how expensive that love is to maintain. The attack came at 8:47 p.m. Sophie had been in bed for an hour, reading a book about a girl who could talk to animals, when the coughing started. Not the dry, shallow cough of a mild episode. The deep, wet, barking sound that Garrett's nervous system recognized before his conscious mind could process it. The sound that meant the bronchial walls were closing and the air was being squeezed through a space that was shrinking by the second. He was in her room in 4 strides. She was sitting up, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the comforter, her chest heaving with the effort of pulling oxygen through passages that her own body was trying to seal shut. He grabbed the inhaler from her nightstand, shook it, pressed it to her lips, counted the puff, held her shoulders, counted to 10. The wheezing did not stop. He administered the second puff, waited. The wheezing thinned but did not break. Her lips were changing color. He wrapped her in a blanket, carried her to the truck, and drove to Providence Portland Medical Center in 11 minutes, running 2 red lights and making a sound in his throat that was not a word, but a prayer compressed into a frequency that only fathers in moving vehicles at night can produce. The emergency department took her within 3 minutes of arrival. Triage nurses who heard the wheeze from 10 feet away and moved with the urgency of people trained to recognize the sound of a closing airway. They started a nebulizer treatment, administered a systemic corticosteroid, and attached a pulse oximeter to her finger that glowed red in the dim room like a tiny distress signal. Her oxygen saturation was 89%. It should have been 97. Garrett stood in the hallway outside the treatment bay, his back against the wall, his hands at his sides. He looked at his palms. The calluses were thick across the base of each finger, built up over years of wrenches and screwdrivers and the 1,000 daily abrasions of manual labor. These hands had stabilized the core of a technology system that processed 9% of North American data traffic. These hands had turned a quarter-inch bolt and saved 3,000 jobs and a $2.3 billion merger. These hands could not buy his daughter the medication she needed to breathe. The arithmetic of his life had never been so clear or so cruel. The attending physician found him at 9:32. A woman in her 50s with tired eyes and the careful diction of someone who delivers difficult news on a schedule. Sophie was stable. The acute episode had been managed, but the pattern of escalation was concerning. 3 significant events in 5 months, each one more severe than the last. The current maintenance regimen was no longer adequate. She recommended transitioning to a combination therapy that included a newer biologic agent, administered monthly by injection, with dramatically better outcomes for pediatric patients with Sophie's profile. The cost, without insurance, was $4,200 per month. With the standard commercial insurance plan, it would be reduced to a copay of approximately $300. The physician paused, checked her notes, and added with the neutral precision of someone reading a chart rather than a verdict. Our records show your dependent coverage was discontinued as of 5 p.m. today. Would you like to speak with our financial counseling department about payment options? Garrett nodded. He did not trust his voice to carry anything other than the answer, and the answer was a single syllable that he delivered without inflection, because inflection would have required him to acknowledge the distance between what his daughter needed and what he could provide, and that distance, measured in dollars, was approximately $49,000 per year, which was more than he had earned in any of the last 8 years, and which represented, in the brutal calculus of American healthcare, the price of a child's breath. Sophie was asleep when he went back in. The nebulizer had been removed. Her breathing was even, shallow, but steady. The whistle reduced to a faint suggestion that only Garrett's trained ear could detect. He sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand, small and warm and impossibly fragile, and she stirred without waking, her fingers curling around his thumb the way they had curled around his thumb on the day she was born. In a different hospital, in a different city, in a life that had ended the same night it was supposed to begin. She opened her eyes at 10:15, not all the way, just enough to find his face in the dim room, to confirm that the one constant in her universe was still present, still solid, still within reach. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw by the coughing. "Dad, are you sad? You always look sad." His throat closed around something that was not an obstruction, but felt like one. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking. Mom used to say you think too much." A pause. The kind of pause that only children can create, empty of calculation and full of honesty. She said, "Sometimes you just have to do the thing. Stop thinking and do it." Garrett went very still. Lauren had said those exact words to him in the kitchen of the San Jose apartment 3 days before Sophie was born, while he was agonizing over whether to accept the Aegis directorship or stay in the research division. She had put her hand on his cheek and smiled and said, "Sometimes you just have to do the thing, Garrett. Stop thinking and do it." Sophie had never heard that story. Sophie had been 3 weeks old when Lauren died. There was no recording, no letter, no video where Lauren said those words in Sophie's presence. And yet here they were, delivered in a child's raspy voice in a hospital room at 10:15 on a Friday night, as if the dead could speak through the living when the living needed to hear it most. He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes. He sat in the dark and listened to her breathe. 6 miles away, Inside the command center of Apex Systems, the screens turned red for the second time in 3 weeks. The failure was different this time. Not a crash, but a hemorrhage. Data was moving, not through the authorized channels, not through the firewalls, not through any pathway that the monitoring systems were designed to track. It was flowing outward through a covert tunnel that had been bored through the deepest layer of the core architecture, a tunnel so precisely engineered that it mimicked legitimate backup traffic and would have been undetectable by any standard security audit. 50 million customer records, names, financial data, authentication credentials, transaction histories, were being siphoned through this tunnel at a rate of approximately 12,000 records per second, routed through a chain of anonymizing proxies that would make the data effectively unrecoverable once it reached its destination. Vincent Hale had built the bomb well. The first device, the resonance sabotage, had been the distraction, the loud explosion designed to draw every eye and every resource to the visible wound. The second device was the real weapon, a dormant extraction protocol buried in a firmware layer that predated the current engineering team's tenure, set to activate exactly 14 days after the first incident, timed with the precision of a man who understood that the best moment to rob a house is while the owners are still congratulating themselves on surviving the fire. Keene learned about the breach at 11:41 p.m. when the head of information security burst into his temporary office with a face the color of ash. The technical details washed over Keene like a foreign language. Exfiltration tunnels, proxy chains, firmware-level access. But the summary required no translation. 50 million customers, personal data, actively leaking. Every minute of inaction was a minute closer to the kind of regulatory catastrophe that destroyed companies not through bankruptcy, but through criminal prosecution. The head of security said the words "class action," and Keene's face betrayed something beneath the composure. Not shock, but the panicked recognition of a co-conspirator realizing he had not been told the full plan. Bryce Calloway and his team spent 4 hours attempting to locate the extraction tunnel. They could not find it. The tunnel existed in a layer of the architecture that their diagnostic tools could not reach, because their diagnostic tools had been designed for the system as they understood it, and their understanding stopped 3 layers above the foundation. They were cardiologists trying to treat a disease of the skeleton. By 3 a.m., 12 million records had been exfiltrated, the rate was accelerating, and Bryce was sitting at his terminal with his head in his hands, staring at a screen full of green indicators that were lying to him with the serene confidence of instruments that do not know they are broken. Catherine found Garrett in the hospital waiting room at 6:17 a.m. Saturday morning. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn to the board meeting the previous day, minus the jacket, her skin gray with sleeplessness, a woman who had been betrayed twice in 72 hours, once by a mentor and once by an institution she believed was hers. She had driven to his apartment first, found it empty, and sat in her car in the parking lot for 9 minutes before calling Frank Novak, who told her where Garrett was. She stood in the doorway of the waiting room and looked at him. He was sitting in a molded plastic chair that was not designed for comfort or dignity, his elbows on his knees, his hands hanging between them, his eyes fixed on a point on the linoleum floor that contained nothing but the reflection of fluorescent light. He looked like a man who had been emptied, not broken, because broken implies the possibility of repair, but emptied, drained of the fuel that had kept him moving through 3 years of invisibility and 8 years of grief, and 41 years of being the strongest person in every room he entered while carrying a weight that no one else could see. She sat down in the chair beside him. She did not touch him. She did not begin with the crisis, or the breach, or the 50 million records bleeding into the dark. She began with the only thing that mattered in the geometry of the moment. "Is Sophie all right?" He nodded without looking up. "Stable. They're keeping her until tomorrow for observation." "What happened?" "Asthma attack. Severe. The maintenance medication isn't working anymore. She needs a new protocol. $4,000 a month. I lost the insurance yesterday, as I'm sure you know." Catherine sat with that information for a moment, quietly measuring the weight of her crisis against his. She had come to ask Garrett Mercer to save her company for the second time. She was sitting next to a man who could not save his daughter's lungs without a benefits card that a man named Richard Keene had revoked with a memo. "The system is hemorrhaging, Garrett." Vincent planted a second device, a data extraction tunnel in the deep firmware. 50 million records. Bryce can't find it. Keene can't stop it. Every hour the leak continues, we move closer to federal prosecution and complete dissolution. I'm not CEO anymore. I have no authority, no access, no team. I have nothing except the knowledge that the only person who can stop this is sitting in a hospital waiting room. Garrett did not move. When he spoke, his voice was flat, scraped down to the substrate beneath emotion, the bedrock voice of a man who has reached the bottom of what he is willing to give. "I stepped out of the shadows, Catherine. I let myself be seen. I let myself care about that machine again. And the reward was immediate. I lost my job. I lost my insurance. And my daughter is in a hospital bed struggling to breathe because I cannot afford the medication that a doctor told me she needs. The last time I let a machine pull me in, my wife got in a car at 2 a.m. to come get me because I couldn't stop working, and she died on Interstate 84 because I loved a system more than I loved the person who loved me. I will not lose another person to another machine. I am done." The words hung in the fluorescent air between them, heavy and final, and Catherine felt them land not as a refusal, but as a confession. The first honest thing Garrett Mercer had said to another adult in 8 years. The admission he had carried in the sealed chamber of his chest like a piece of shrapnel too close to the heart to remove. She understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of her own crisis, that she was not talking to a man who was unwilling to help. She was talking to a man who was afraid that helping would cost him the only thing he had left. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. She pressed them together in her lap and spoke, and what came out was not a pitch or a plea or a corporate strategy, but the truth, unfiltered, delivered in a voice that cracked in places she did not try to conceal. "My father died at his desk, 11:14 p.m., a Tuesday. His heart stopped while he was reading a diagnostic report. His assistant found him the next morning. His coffee was still warm." She paused. The memory was not something she accessed. It was something that lived in her body, in the tension along her jaw, in the way her right hand always reached for her left wrist when she was frightened, the same gesture her father made when he was thinking. "I swore I would not become him. I swore I would not sacrifice my life for a building full of servers and stock tickers. And then I spent 10 years doing exactly that. Telling myself it was different because I was doing it for his legacy instead of my own ambition, as if the name you write on the chain changes the weight of it." A tear ran down her left cheek. She did not wipe it away. She let it fall onto the back of her hand, where it caught the light and held it for a moment before dissolving into skin. It was the first time she had cried in front of another person since her father's funeral, and she did it in a hospital waiting room in a plastic chair next to a maintenance man who understood exactly what it cost, because he had paid the same price in a different currency on a different night in a different hospital, and the receipt was the same. Garrett looked at her. Not at the CEO, not at the woman who had offered him millions, at the person who was sitting beside him in the particular loneliness of someone who has spent their entire life building walls and has just realized that walls keep things out and in with equal efficiency. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. His phone rang at 7:04. Frank Novak's name on the screen. He answered. Frank's voice was gravel and distance and military bluntness. He had spent 20 years in uniform and never learned to soften a message because gentle delivery was a luxury that operational environments could not afford. I heard you got cut loose. I heard about Sophie. I'm not going to ask if you're okay because I can hear that you're not, and I'm not in the business of asking questions I already know the answer to. A pause. Garrett could hear Frank breathing, the slow, measured cadence of a man choosing his next words, the way a demolition expert chooses where to place the charge. I don't know who you were before you showed up at Apex with a toolbox and a look on your face like a man who'd made a deal with God to be invisible. I don't care. I know who you are now. You're the only decent man in that building. You're the only person who ever looked at me like I was a human being instead of a uniform standing next to a door. I served 20 years. I know the difference between a man who's running away and a man who's resting between fights. You've been resting long enough, Garrett. It's time. The call ended. Garrett set the phone down. He sat in the silence of the waiting room and felt the architecture of his resistance, the carefully constructed walls of guilt and fear and self-imposed exile, begin to develop cracks, not from force, but from the accumulated pressure of people who kept showing up at the edges of his isolation and refusing to leave. He went back into Sophie's room at 7:30. She was still sleeping. The pulse oximeter on her finger glowed its steady red. Her breathing was even. The morning light was beginning to filter through the window, casting a pale rectangle on the linoleum that crept slowly toward the bed like something cautious and hopeful. He sat in the chair beside her and opened the drawer of the bedside table, looking for the nurse's call button, and his hand touched paper. The envelope was creased and soft with age, the corners rounded from years of being carried and never opened. He recognized it immediately. It had been in his wallet for 8 years. Lauren's handwriting on the front, the blue ink slightly faded, the letters formed with the particular care of someone writing something they intend to last. She had given it to him 3 days before Sophie was born, pressing it into his hand with a smile that contained a knowledge he would not understand until it was too late. Open this when you're ready to fly again. He had transferred it from wallet to nightstand drawer to wallet again dozens of times over the years, carrying it like a talisman whose power depended on remaining sealed. He had brought it to the hospital out of habit. It was in his jacket pocket when he carried Sophie to the truck, and he had placed it in the drawer while she slept, the way he always placed it near wherever she was, as though Lauren's words could protect their daughter through the paper they were written on. His hands trembled as he opened it, not from cold, not from exhaustion, from the specific physical fear of hearing a voice that he had spent 8 years trying to deserve and failing. The letter was 1 page. Lauren's handwriting filled it margin to margin, the letters small and even, written by a woman who was 9 months pregnant and running out of space in every sense. My love, I know you will read this when you are at your most frightened. I know you, Garrett. I know that the thing you are afraid of is not failure, or danger, or even death. You are afraid of becoming the man you were on the nights you forgot to come home. The man who loved the machine more than the life waiting for him on the other side of the door. I need you to hear me say this in writing, so you cannot argue with me the way you argue with everything. You did not kill me. You did not cause what happened. I drove that night because I loved you, because I wanted to see your face, because the baby was kicking, and I wanted your hand on my belly when she did it. That was my choice, my love, my drive. You have been punishing yourself for a decision I made freely and would make again. Hiding in the dark is not protecting Sophie. You are the brightest thing I have ever known, and you shine brightest when you are doing what you were made to do. Our daughter does not need a father who is safe. She needs a father who is whole. Fly again, Garrett, for her, for the world that needs what you carry, and if you must, fly for me, because I am the woman who drove through the dark to find you, and I would be so proud to see you back in the light. All my love, all my faith, always, Lauren. Garrett folded the letter. He pressed it against his chest with both hands. He closed his eyes and felt the tears come. Not the silent, controlled leaking of a man managing his grief in public, but the deep, shaking, full-body release of 8 years of compressed guilt finding its way out through the only exit available. He cried the way structures fail when the load they were never designed to carry is finally, mercifully, removed, completely, catastrophically, and with a strange, devastating relief that felt like the first breath after drowning. Sophie did not wake. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The morning light reached the edge of her bed. Garrett wiped his face with the heels of his hands. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, over his heart. He picked up his phone. He dialed Catherine's number. She answered on the first ring, as though she had been holding the phone in her hand since she left the waiting room, which she had. His voice was raw, stripped of every layer of protection he had built over 8 years, and underneath all of it was something that sounded like the first notes of an engine turning over after a long winter. Rough, uncertain, but alive. I'm coming back on my terms. He arrived at the Apex campus at 11:43 p.m. Saturday night, driving the F-150 through a light rain that turned the streetlights into smeared columns of orange and white. The visitor lot was empty. The executive lot held 3 vehicles: Keene's black Mercedes, Bryce Calloway's Tesla, and a white government sedan that Garrett did not recognize but whose federal plates he filed away without comment. The building was lit from the inside with the sickly glow of a crisis in progress. Every floor visible through the glass walls like a cross-section of a body on an operating table. He parked in the maintenance lot behind Building 7, the same spot he had parked in every morning for 3 years and 7 months. The rain collected on the hood of the truck in beads that caught the security lights and held them, tiny points of illumination on old green paint, and Garrett sat behind the wheel for 45 seconds, his hands resting on the steering column, feeling the engine tick as it cooled. Lauren's letter was in his breast pocket. Sophie was sleeping in a hospital bed 6 miles east, her oxygen saturation holding at 94%, her nurse on a 2-hour check cycle, her father's phone number written on the whiteboard above her bed in handwriting that the charge nurse had described as the most precise block lettering she had ever seen from a non-military parent. He had kissed her forehead before he left. She had not woken. The pulse oximeter had glowed its steady red, a small mechanical promise that the night would hold. Frank Novak was waiting at the service entrance of Building 7, standing in the rain without an umbrella, his gray crew cut darkened by water, his security badge clipped to the breast pocket of a uniform that had been washed so many times the company logo had faded to a suggestion. He held the door open without ceremony, without greeting, without any of the conversational architecture that civilians use to fill the space between intention and action. He simply stood aside and let Garrett pass, then fell into step behind him the way a wingman falls into formation, slightly back, slightly right, covering the angle that the lead cannot see. They moved through the service corridor on the ground floor, past the custodial supply room where Garrett had stored his backup tools, past the mechanical room where the building's heart, a massive HVAC system that Garrett had tuned to a precision its manufacturers had not specified, hummed with the steady, untroubled rhythm of a machine that did not know the organization it served, was bleeding to death 12 floors above. Garrett knew every inch of this corridor. He knew the security camera at the junction of corridors B and C had a 4-degree blind spot caused by a mounting bracket that building maintenance had installed 6 millimeters too far to the left. He knew the freight elevator on the east side of the building had a manual override that bypassed the badge reader if you held the door close button for 3 seconds while pressing the floor selector. He knew the server wing on the 4th floor had an auxiliary access point through the ventilation plenum that connected to the raised floor system, a pathway designed for cable routing that was wide enough for a man of average build to traverse on his hands and knees. He knew these things because he was a maintenance worker who had spent 3 years learning the anatomy of a building that did not know it was being studied by its creator. The knowledge of a janitor and the knowledge of an architect had merged into something that neither role could have produced alone. A complete, 3-dimensional understanding of the building as a living system, from its ventilation capillaries to its data arteries to the structural bones that held everything upright and apart. Frank's badge opened the freight elevator. Garrett pressed 4. The elevator rose with the unhurried mechanical patience of equipment that had never been asked to participate in corporate espionage and was not about to start rushing now. At the 4th floor, the doors opened onto the darkened service hallway adjacent to the server wing. Through the fire door's narrow window, Garrett could see the glow of monitors and the shapes of engineers moving between workstations with the frantic, purposeless energy of people who have been awake too long and accomplished too little. Frank handed him a flashlight. Their eyes met in the dim corridor, and Frank's expression carried the particular density of a man compressing a long speech into a short silence. What came out was 5 words, delivered with the economy of someone who believed that language, like ammunition, should not be wasted. "I'll be at the door." Garrett entered the ventilation plenum through an access panel that he himself had repaired 7 months ago, replacing a corroded hinge that facilities management had deemed non-critical. He moved through the horizontal shaft on his forearms and knees, the metal ductwork cold against his palms, the sound of his own breathing amplified by the enclosure into something rhythmic and meditative, like the breathing of a diver descending. He emerged through a floor panel behind Rack 12, in a section of the server wing that the engineering team had not entered because it housed the legacy infrastructure, the original architecture, his architecture, that the current diagnostic tools could not interface with, and that the current engineering team regarded with the vague, inherited disrespect of tenants who have never met the landlord. He opened his laptop, a machine as old and worn as his wrench, its case held together with electrical tape in 2 places, its hard drive containing tools and access protocols that did not exist in any commercial software repository, because Garrett had written them himself, 12 years ago, in a language that was equal parts code and intuition. He connected to the legacy monitoring system through a hard-wired port that the current network topology did not include in its maps, because the port predated the maps by a decade. The system recognized him the way a house recognizes its builder, immediately, completely, without the need for credentials or ceremony. The extraction tunnel was visible on his screen within 90 seconds. It was elegant. Garrett had to acknowledge that, even as his stomach turned at the scope of what it was doing. Vincent had threaded it through the deepest firmware layer, piggybacking on the backup verification protocol, disguising 50 million stolen lives as routine system maintenance. It was the work of someone who understood the architecture almost as well as Garrett did, which made sense, because Vincent had been in the room 12 years ago when Garrett had presented the original blueprints. And Vincent had been taking notes that Garrett now understood were not for the benefit of the project, but for the construction of a weapon that would take a decade to deploy. The countdown was real and immediate. At the current exfiltration rate, the remaining 38 million uncompromised records would be extracted within 22 minutes. After that, the data would be routed through an anonymization chain that would make recovery impossible. 22 minutes. Garrett felt the familiar compression of time around a crisis, the way the universe narrows to a single point of focus, the way irrelevant information falls away like scaffolding from a completed structure, leaving only the problem and the tools and the distance between them. He began. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a fluency that surprised even him, muscle memory surfacing from a depth he had thought was sealed permanently, code flowing from his hands the way language flows from a native speaker returning to their mother tongue after years of exile. He was not typing commands. He was having a conversation with a machine he had built, in a dialect only the two of them spoke, asking it to show him where it was wounded and how deep the blade had gone. The first countermeasure hit at the 14-minute mark. Keene, or someone acting on Keene's authority, had installed an additional firewall layer on the legacy ports, a crude but effective barrier that severed Garrett's connection to the extraction tunnel and locked him out of the firmware layer. His screen went dark. He sat in the silence behind rack 12 and recalculated. 3 seconds. He rerouted through an auxiliary diagnostic bus that connected the legacy system to the environmental monitoring network, a pathway designed for temperature sensors and humidity alerts, never intended to carry data traffic, but wide enough for the surgical commands he needed to deliver. The connection reestablished. The tunnel reappeared. The second failure came at 9 minutes remaining. Vincent's code included a logic trap, a recursive loop that activated when it detected unauthorized access to the extraction protocol, designed to crash the entire core and destroy the forensic evidence along with it. Garrett saw it trigger, saw the cascade begin, saw the system temperature spike as processing resources were diverted into the loop's infinite hunger. He had 4 seconds before the crash became irreversible. He wrote 6 lines of code, not typed, written the way a poet writes, each word placed with the precision of a man who understands that in this particular language, a misplaced semicolon is the difference between salvation and catastrophe, and injected them into the loop's input stream, feeding it a null reference that collapsed the recursion like a house of cards hit by a single, perfectly aimed breath. The temperature dropped. The core stabilized. The tunnel was still active. 7 minutes. The third near failure was the worst. At 4 minutes remaining, the extraction protocol detected Garrett's counter-intrusion and activated a dead man switch, a final safeguard that would corrupt the database index, rendering the remaining records permanently inaccessible even if the tunnel was closed. The switch was counting down from 30 seconds. Garrett could see it on his screen, a small red number decrementing with the calm, mechanical indifference of a device that does not care what it destroys. He could stop the tunnel or stop the switch. He could not do both. Not with the tools he had. But the tools he had were not the only tools available. He reached into the architecture itself. Not the code, not the firmware, not the software layers that Vincent and Bryce and every other engineer thought of as the system. He reached into the physical layer, the hardware timing protocols that govern the synchronization between storage platters and read-write heads, the layer where physics met engineering, where electricity became information, where the machine stopped being an abstraction and became a thing with a body. He adjusted the clock signal on the primary storage controller by 11 nanoseconds, a modification so small it was unmeasurable by any instrument in the building, but large enough to desynchronize the dead man switch from the database index it was targeting. The switch fired. It hit nothing. The corruption command dissipated into empty address space like a bullet fired into fog. Garrett closed the tunnel. The exfiltration stopped. 38 million records remained intact. The forensic evidence of the breach, origin points, routing data, timestamps, Vincent Hale's signature in every line of the extraction code, was preserved in the system logs with the clarity of a confession written in the perpetrator's own hand. He sat behind rack 12 in the dark, his laptop screen casting blue light on his face, his hands resting on the keyboard, his pulse decelerating from a frequency he had not experienced in 12 years. The wrench was on the floor beside him, where he had placed it when he entered. He had not needed it tonight. Tonight had been a different kind of repair. Invisible, digital, performed in a language of electrons rather than metal. But the wrench was there. And its presence mattered in the way that all anchors matter to people who have learned what it costs to drift. The emergency board session convened at 9 a.m. Sunday morning. Keene had called it himself, which was his final miscalculation. He had intended to present his restructuring plan, the controlled demolition of Apex systems that would deliver the company's carcass to Vincent's consortium at a price that made the word acquisition a euphemism for theft. He had prepared slides. He had prepared talking points. He had prepared a narrative in which Catherine Locke's reckless leadership had caused a catastrophic data breach that only decisive new management, his management, could contain. He had not prepared for the door of the conference room to open at 9:12, 12 minutes after his presentation began, and for Garrett Mercer to walk through it. Garrett was not wearing his maintenance jumpsuit. He was not wearing a suit. He wore a plain white Oxford shirt, open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the forearms, and carried the same battered laptop he had used 6 hours earlier to save 50 million people's financial identities from disappearing into the dark. He walked to the presentation screen at the front of the room with the unhurried gait of a man who has been in larger rooms with higher stakes and who measures urgency not by the volume of the voices around him, but by the proximity of the problem to the breaking point. The board members stared. Margaret Ashford, the dissenting director, leaned back in her chair with an expression that suggested the morning had just become significantly more interesting. Keen's face underwent a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, anger, before settling on the default expression of a man who has built his career on composure and refuses to abandon it even when the ground beneath him is liquefying. Garrett connected his laptop to the room's display system. The screen behind him filled with data: time-stamped logs, network routing diagrams, firmware signatures, financial transaction records. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain who he was or why he was there. He spoke directly to the evidence, walking the board through the anatomy of Vincent Hale's two-stage attack with the precise, unhurried clarity of a surgeon explaining an operation to medical students. The first device, the resonance sabotage, designed to crash the system during the merger synchronization, create a stock collapse, and enable a hostile acquisition at distressed prices. The second device, the data extraction tunnel, activated on a 14-day delay, designed to exfiltrate 50 million customer records and provide leverage, insurance, and revenue to the acquiring consortium. The authorization codes for both devices traced to Vincent Hale's terminal. The financial records from Vincent's encrypted drives, now in FBI custody, showed quarterly payments to a member of this board, routed through 4 shell companies, totaling $2.7 million over 19 months. Garrett turned to Richard Keen. The room was silent in the particular way that rooms become silent when everyone present understands that the next sentence will determine someone's future. Keen tried. His voice found its footing on the familiar terrain of authority and indignation. This is absurd. You're a maintenance worker. You have no credentials, no clearance, no authority to access any system in this building. Every piece of evidence on that screen was obtained illegally and is inadmissible in any... I designed every system in this building. Garrett's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It carried the density of a fact so fundamental that arguing against it was like arguing against the weight of the floor. Every protocol, every encryption layer, every security architecture that you attempted to compromise. I wrote the language this company thinks in. I built the foundation this company stands on. And I have spent the last 12 hours inside that foundation reading the cracks that you and Vincent Hale put there. And I have documented every single one of them with the precision that the FBI requires, and the patience that 12 years of building things has taught me. He turned back to the screen and displayed the final slide. A communication log showing encrypted messages between Keen's personal device and a server registered to Hale's attorney, including the message that had initiated the emergency board session that removed Catherine from power, the dates, the content, the shell company routing. The connection to a foreign technology consortium that the FBI was now investigating as a matter of national security. The door opened. 2 men in dark suits entered with the particular posture and economy of movement that announces federal authority more effectively than any badge. They did not wait for the meeting to adjourn. They walked directly to Richard Keen, who was still sitting in his chair, his hands flat on the mahogany table, his face carrying the expression of a man watching the architecture of his ambition collapse in real time, with the slow, irreversible certainty of a controlled demolition. Margaret Ashford called for an immediate vote to reinstate Catherine Locke as CEO and to terminate Richard Keen's board membership. The vote was unanimous. Catherine entered the conference room 4 minutes later, escorted by the corporate counsel who had spent the night preparing the legal framework for her return. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the board members who had voted to remove her 72 hours ago, and who were now looking at her with the uneasy awareness of people who had made a mistake they could not undo and must now simply own. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. She did not mention the betrayal. She did not mention the vote. She said, "We came within hours of losing everything, not because of a software failure or a market downturn, but because we built a culture that valued credentials over competence and loyalty over integrity. We dismissed the people who actually understood this company because they didn't look the way we expected expertise to look. That ends today. Starting now, every person in this organization will be evaluated on what they can do, not on what their resume says they should be able to do." Howard Prewitt, the gray-haired Meridian auditor who had recognized Garrett during the stress test, approached him in the hallway after the session. He was accompanied by 2 Meridian executives who looked at Garrett the way students look at a professor they had previously mistaken for a janitor. Prewitt extended his hand again, and this time the handshake lasted longer. "Mr. Mercer, Meridian doesn't just want to complete the merger with Apex. We want you. Consulting architect for the combined entity. Name your terms." Garrett looked at Prewitt. He looked at the Meridian executives. He looked through the glass wall of the conference room, where Catherine was still standing at the head of the table, and their eyes met the way they had met across the command center 2 weeks ago. Briefly, fully, carrying more information than language could encode. He turned back to Prewitt. "I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Right now, I need to pick up my daughter from the hospital." He walked toward the elevator. Behind him, the boardroom erupted into the controlled chaos of restoration. Legal teams mobilizing, communications staff drafting press releases, engineers receiving new access protocols. But in the hallway, for a span of perhaps 8 seconds, there was silence. And in that silence, every person within line of sight stopped what they were doing and watched Garrett Mercer walk away. Not because he was famous, not because he was powerful, because he had just held their world together with his bare hands and set it down gently and was now leaving to hold something smaller and infinitely more important. Bryce Calloway caught him at the elevator. He was standing against the wall as if he had been waiting there, though the redness around his eyes suggested he had not planned what he was about to do, so much as arrived at it through the exhaustion of alternatives. He did not extend his hand. He looked at the floor, then at Garrett, then at the floor again. And what came out of him was not polished or rehearsed, or delivered with the strategic calibration that had characterized every sentence Garrett had ever heard him speak. "I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." Garrett studied him, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet attention of an engineer assessing whether something broken could still be fixed. "You're a talented engineer, Bryce. You just forgot that machines have souls. Stop reading the screens. Start listening." He placed his hand briefly on Bryce's shoulder, the same hand that had turned a bolt and closed a tunnel and opened a letter, and stepped into the elevator. Sophie was sitting up in her hospital bed when he arrived, eating orange gelatin with a plastic spoon, her color improved, her breathing audible, but steady. She looked up when he entered, and her face produced the smile that could illuminate parking structures, and she held up her pinky finger. He hooked it with his own. 315 forever. Pinky promise. Catherine offered him the CTO position on a Monday morning, standing in the rebuilt command center where the monitors glowed a steady, uneventful green that no one in the building would ever take for granted again. She presented the package with the same precision she brought to everything: compensation, equity, authority, a corner office with a view of the mountain his daughter liked to draw. Garrett listened with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes on the server rack he had knelt beside 3 weeks ago. And when she finished, he shook his head with the unhurried finality of a man who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the conversation to arrive at the place where he can deliver it. He would consult 4 hours a day, 8 to noon, his schedule, his methods, his terms. Full medical benefits for Sophie, including the biologic therapy that had already been approved by the new pulmonologist at Providence. He would not attend board meetings. He would not give press interviews. He would not wear a badge that said anything other than his name. At 12:01, he would walk to his truck, and at 3:15, he would be standing at the school gate. And the distance between those two commitments was the architecture of a life he was no longer willing to compromise. Catherine accepted without negotiation. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the building, that the most valuable things in the world are the ones that cannot be purchased at any price and can only be earned by knowing when to stop buying. His workspace was not the corner office Catherine had offered. It was a small room on the 4th floor, adjacent to the server wing, with a single window that looked out over the maintenance lot where the F-150 sat in the same spot it had occupied every morning for 3 years. He had requested it specifically. Catherine had raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The room contained a desk, a chair, a whiteboard, and a coffee maker that Frank Novak delivered on the first morning with a note taped to the handle that read, "Don't let them give you the artisanal stuff." Garrett taped Sophie's owl drawing to the wall above his monitor, the purple one with the hard hat and wrench, and placed a photograph of Lauren on the desk beside his keyboard, facing the chair, so that every morning when he sat down, she was the first thing he saw. And every noon, when he stood up, she was the last. Frank Novak was promoted to Director of Physical Security the following week, a title that came with a salary increase he described as offensive in a good way, and an office on the 2nd floor that he furnished with exactly 1 chair, 1 desk, and a coffee maker that produced coffee so strong it could reasonably be classified as a construction material. He stopped by Garrett's office every morning at 7:55 with 2 cups, and they sat in the kind of silence that 2 men share when they have already said the only things that matter and are now simply keeping each other company while the world catches up. The first time Catherine came to the bench in Wallace Park was a Wednesday in November, 3 weeks after the board reinstated her. She arrived unannounced, carrying 2 coffees, and an expression she had been composing for 6 blocks. Sophie had looked up from her homework and said, without preamble, "You're the queen lady. Dad talks about you. He says you're very smart, but you work too hard." Catherine had looked at Garrett, who was studying the tree line with the intense focus of a man wishing the earth would open beneath his bench. She sat down. She stayed for 40 minutes. She came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. The conversations began as debriefs. She would ask about the system architecture. He would answer in the particular shorthand of 2 people who understood the machine but approached it from different altitudes. But the debriefs widened the way rivers widen near the coast, losing their urgency and gaining breadth. She told him about the first board meeting she attended after her father's death, how she had worn his watch and kept her hand in her pocket so no one would see it shaking. He told her about the day Sophie took her first steps in the kitchen of the Portland apartment, reaching for a stuffed rabbit on the floor, and how he had sat on the linoleum afterward and cried because Lauren should have been there to see it. They exchanged losses the way travelers exchange currencies, not at equal value, but with the mutual recognition that both had been earned in countries the other had never visited. Sophie observed the progression with the unfiltered analytical precision of an 8-year-old. One evening, brushing her teeth, she informed Garrett through a mouthful of toothpaste. "Catherine smiles different when she looks at you, like she found something she lost." Garrett stood in the bathroom doorway holding a towel and felt the accuracy of his daughter's observation settle into his chest with the weight of something he had been avoiding naming. On a Saturday in December, Catherine brought Sophie a gift. A stethoscope, child-sized, with an owl charm attached to the tubing. Sophie spent the next hour listening to Garrett's heart, the refrigerator motor, the truck engine, and the wall of the apartment behind which the pipes ran, announcing with the authority of a newly minted diagnostician that everything sounded healthy except the refrigerator, which was a little sad. Catherine watched from the kitchen table and laughed, not the controlled, calibrated laugh she used in boardrooms, but the unguarded sound of a woman who had spent so many years building walls that she had forgotten what it felt like to sit inside a room without them. 6 months passed. The merger closed. The investigation expanded. Vincent Hale pleaded guilty to federal charges of corporate sabotage and conspiracy. Richard Keene's case went to trial in the Eastern District of Oregon, where a jury of 12 people who had never heard of distributed consensus protocols or firmware extraction tunnels listened to 3 weeks of testimony and returned a verdict in 4 hours. The shell companies were dissolved. The foreign consortium withdrew. Apex Systems stock recovered, then climbed, then reached a valuation that made the original merger terms look conservative. Garrett taught a weekly technical seminar for the engineering team on Tuesday afternoons, an informal session held in the 4th floor conference room where he stood at a whiteboard and drew system architectures freehand, while Bryce Calloway sat in the front row taking notes with the focused intensity of a student who has discovered, late but not too late, that the most important things he needed to learn were not available in any curriculum he had previously valued. Sophie's biologic therapy was working. Her peak flow numbers had stabilized in the green zone for 4 consecutive months. She had not visited an emergency room since the night Garrett carried her to the truck in a blanket. She drew a new picture for the refrigerator every week. The most recent one showed a man with large hands standing next to a woman with long hair. Between them, a small girl holding both their hands. Underneath, in purple crayon, family. On a Thursday afternoon in April, Garrett and Sophie sat at their bench in Wallace Park, sharing a chocolate ice cream cone in the late spring sunlight. The grass was green. The air smelled of cut lawn and river water and the particular freshness that Portland produces in the narrow window between the end of rain and the beginning of summer. Sophie was telling him about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda, her hands moving in wide descriptive arcs that endangered the structural integrity of the ice cream. Her voice carrying the bright, unguarded energy of a child whose lungs were filling completely for the first time in her memory. Catherine arrived at 3:20, carrying 3 cones, chocolate, vanilla, and a second chocolate that she handed to Sophie with the practiced ease of someone who had made this walk across this grass enough times that the route had become a path. She sat down on the plastic bench beside Garrett. She was not wearing a suit. Her hair was down. She looked like a woman who had stopped trying to fill a space shaped like someone else and had started building one shaped like herself. Sophie looked at Catherine's cone. "You always get chocolate." Catherine smiled. "I like certainty." Garrett's hand rested on the bench between them. Catherine placed her hand beside his. Their fingers touched, then interlaced. The gesture carrying the weight of 2 people who had arrived at each other not through attraction or convenience, but through the slow, honest process of standing in the same fire and discovering they were made of the same material. Garrett's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. Unknown number. He looked at the screen, then at Sophie, then at Catherine. He smiled. Not the controlled, invisible smile of a man managing his emotions, but the full, unguarded expression of a man who has finally stopped hiding from his own light. He silenced the phone and slid it back into his pocket. Tomorrow. Sophie licked her cone and squinted at him. Dad, what are you going to fix tomorrow? He looked at the sky above Portland, where the clouds were breaking apart to reveal the kind of blue that makes promises it might actually keep. Whatever needs fixing, sweetheart. The sun was warm. The ice cream was cold. The bench was small enough that 3 people sitting on it had to sit close together, which was the entire point. Somewhere in the pocket over his heart, a letter written by a woman who drove through the dark to find him rested against his chest. And if the wind had been quiet enough and the world had been still enough, you might have heard her voice, faint as a frequency only he could detect, whispering the words she had left for him to find when he was ready. Fly again, Garrett. For her, for the world, for me. He was flying.